Colin, due to the extraordinary complexity or mystery, as you've called it, of consciousness, some have used consciousness as a way of undermining materialism for perhaps legitimate reasons, or perhaps because they have an agenda, often theological. How do you view consciousness being used by some to undermine materialism?
I think it's legitimate to undermine materialism in what I would call a narrow sense of materialism. That is, the idea that our current knowledge of the brain is sufficient to explain everything about the mind. If that's what we mean by materialism, then that's undermined by consciousness. But that, of course, is not a very surprising claim, because who would suppose that everything about the mind should be explicable within our current knowledge of the brain? So materialism is sometimes understood in that way. However, if it's understood as, does it undermine materialism in a broader sense, then the question is, well, what is that broader sense of materialism? What does materialism mean in that sense? Now, the point I would make is that matter itself has undermined materialism in the classical understanding of materialism, because materialism was closely tied to mechanism, and mechanism has been refuted by physics time and time again. So just as electromagnetism refuted materialism as it was understood in Descartes' time, consciousness also refutes it. But that's matter, that is to say, electromagnetism is refuting materialism. So there must be some other sense of materialism which is being questioned by consciousness, and that's the difficulty to understand what that might be, that further sense of materialism. The difficulty is always, if you interpret materialism in a narrow sense and tie it to our current knowledge, it seems empirically false. If you widen it to include anything that might be discovered by the sciences, then it just seems empty, because it may turn out trivially true. Suppose in the end physics decides it has to make irreducible use of mental states. Then they'll be mental.
Right.
They'll be physical and mental at the same time.
Well, the mental will be physical.
Mental will be physical,
yeah.
but without being reducible to anything else. As such, it will be defined as physical. So then we'll end up calling sensations of red material, just for reasons that, well, we've decided to include them in our overall view. So what we have now really is a problem of integration. We can't integrate the knowledge we have that there are conscious events, conscious states, with the knowledge we have of the physical world as we now understand it, which is a problem of integrating these two things. There seems to be a discontinuity between the physical world as we now understand it and the existence of consciousness.
You've been dealing with consciousness for, what, two and a half decades, or long time, and really have deeply probed it. Why is it, as you've thought about it, that such a large percentage of neuroscientists don't think there's a problem here, that they don't claim that they've solved it, but they claim that the current trajectory is sufficient with neuronal electricity and systems and very complicated forms, but as they go on their current trajectory, they will be able to explain fully consciousness?
I think because they interpret the word consciousness in a different way from the way you and I and most people interpret it. They always mean by consciousness the functions that are performed by a conscious being. So they'll talk about the function of discriminating between one thing and another. And that's their version of what it is to perceive something, to see something. And they'll say, well, look, here's an organism. It can discriminate between this class of objects and these other class of objects, let's say red and green objects.
And we can see the difference in the neurons in their brain.
Exactly. And when we look into their brain, we can see how the neurons enable them to make that distinction, that discrimination, because look, these are active when the red objects are there. Those are active when the green objects are there. We see how those receptor neurons are connected to the motor neurons, which enable the organism to behave in selective ways. And so doesn't neurophysiology explain completely all of that? The answer is yes, it does explain that. But that's not what we mean by consciousness. Consciousness is not just the behavioral association of a conscious state. It is the conscious state itself. But for some reason, neuroscientists, like some psychologists before them, think of everything from a third-person point of view. So they think of describing an organism from the outside and what it does. And they say, well, we can explain all of that in terms of the brain. That may well be true. They forget to think of consciousness as they experience it from a first-person point of view, as everybody experiences from a first-person point of view. And that's where the problem really is at its most vivid. It's not as if, really, on a good analysis, it would be right to say you can explain it from a third-person point of view, but not from a first-person point of view, because after all, what you attribute to another organism, when you say this organism is seeing something red, it's the same kind of thing that you experience in yourself when you say I'm seeing something red. So those other organisms have those mental states. It's just that the neuroscientists tend to look only at the behavioral manifestations of the mental state, not the mental state itself. And they think they can explain the behavioral manifestations.
The next step in that process would be computer scientists, artificial intelligence, so-called strong AI, strong artificial intelligence, who would then say that we can not just simulate consciousness in non-physical, non-biological intelligence, but we can actually create it.
Yeah.
How do you look upon the likelihood or the possibility of creating non-biological intelligence that has consciousness?
Yeah. Well, firstly, in this, people who are optimistic about that question have the same conception of what consciousness is that I was just attributing to the neuroscientists. If you think of consciousness as a set of behavioral dispositions or a set of capacities to cope with the environment, then you'll say, why couldn't I make a machine with behavioral dispositions like the body, like our bodies have? Well, maybe the answer is that wouldn't be in principle very difficult. But that is not the same thing as creating a machine which has the conscious states which underlie those dispositions. Because after all, you might create a machine which duplicates my behavior, so my externals, but doesn't duplicate my interior, my conscious states. So it simply doesn't follow from the fact that you've made a machine which duplicates the behavioral dispositions of a conscious being, that you've made a conscious being. It could be indistinguishable from the outside, at least. From the inside, it would be distinguishable.
Yeah. And we would have no way of knowing that.
Well, we might have a way of knowing it, you see, in certain imaginable cases. Suppose I have a case where I have a degenerative brain disease, and I start losing part of my consciousness, but not all of it. So I start losing, say, my visual sensations, and it starts spreading across my visual field. And I'm aware of this, I experience it going on. But suppose that this brain disease, while it destroys my conscious experience, doesn't destroy my ability to discriminate objects. I can move around just the way I did before. I just process the information. It's blind sight, as people talk about, rather like this. I would know that my consciousness was leaving me, at least partly leaving me. But at the same time, I would notice that my behavior was just as good as before, right? Just as I might suddenly find that I put my hand on a hot plate and my hand withdraws very quickly because all the mechanisms for withdrawal are still there. And I think, oh, that's funny, there's no pain in my hand. So I would know the difference between an automaton and a conscious being from the inside. But the point about the brain, about making the machine, is it simply doesn't follow from the fact that you've duplicated the outside of consciousness, that is, say, what it causes, that you've duplicated the inside.